Ground plans. As we're approaching ground plans, we need to understand the purposes of them in the first place. Ground plans help establish stage placement for our design. As we look at a floor plan of a theater, we will find the plaster line, which is the back of the proscenium, referred to as the plaster line because the front and sides of the proscenium are painted so the audience can see a nice finished frame around the entire production. But the back side is rarely painted, and it's the original plaster. That's where we get the term plaster line. That is the area from which we measure most of our set designs, from the plaster line. The next line that's important to us is the center line, the imaginary line running down the middle of the stage and out to the audience. Often the center line is marked with a CL at the bottom end. With the center line and the plaster line, we can now place our set on stage using the center line and the plaster line to help find its placement on the stage space. A ground plan helps determine the relationship to the auditorium. As we look at the floor plan of a theater, we'll notice at the bottom two dots with little lines radiating out. These represent the two extreme ends of the front row, which also determine the sight lines for the auditorium. This means how much of the stage space the audience can see. If we remove the false proscenium, we'll notice that the audience member on the far house right doesn't see as much backstage on stage left, but can see quite a bit backstage on stage right. And consistently, the other side of the house can see back into the stage left and not as much stage right. When we add the false proscenium, we'll notice that the cone of vision, or the sight lines for that theater, become a little less severe, straight on for the audience members. And what's important to realize once we have the design is to use the cross of all the sight lines to establish how much of the set can be seen and how much of the stage space past the scenery can be seen. A ground plan helps to reveal the heights of walkable units. As we zoom in on our scenic design, we know that this represents the floor plan of a set that has different heights in its platforms. We can't determine those looking straight down on the set unless we designate some of those heights by adding dimensions to represent those heights on the ground plan. You'll notice that the rise of steps in this set are 6 inches. Notice the step unit up center. 1-6, 2 foot, 2-6, 3 foot. This staircase has a 6-inch rise. The bottom step of this unit is 1-6 because all measurements are made from the floor level of the stage. Because this step unit is setting on a 1-foot platform, the first step is at 1-6, and the step unit rises completely up to 5 foot at its top step. You will note that we don't represent the heights of walls on floor plans, only walkable units, step units, platforms, etc. A ground plan shows the use of stage mechanics, such as fly lines, any movable pieces of scenery, or the use of masking and backing to help mask the sight lines. Here's the side view of the theater floor plan, and you'll notice that this stage has a fly system represented with 37 different lines that can be used to fly objects in and out on the stage. So starting at the plaster line, these are all measured back from the theater, and we can therefore find them on stage by drawing a line out from one of those lines. If we choose to use fly line number 5, that is 3 feet 5 inches from the plaster line, we can then lay legs or borders or other devices along these lines to find out where they will actually wind up in relation to the set design. So we need to use the fly lines to establish legs that will help mask backstage as the audience members look over the set and past it. We'll add borders along the top to help mask the battens and the lights above the set. And we will add a backdrop or a cyclorama or a scrim combination of some sort to mask the area behind and beyond the set design. Now, to actually create a ground plan, we'll first start with a scale theater plan. We've been looking at one. We notice the plaster line and we notice the center line that help us determine placement on this stage space. One of the first things we'll want to do is establish our title block, which we'll normally find down in the right-hand corner of a ground plan. Here is where we'll establish the main information or the key information for everyone to understand the plan. First, we'll add our show title and let them know this is the ground plan for our production. We'll then add the date we created this ground plan. We'll add our name as the designer. We'll add the TD's name so we know who the technical director is for this production. And we can either add our name as the drafts person for this ground plan or the person who will be drafting the final version. You will find that if you hand in a ground plan and it has to be cleaned or trued by the shop, they will often change your name to their name in the draftsman slot. As you continue to finish your full design, you will have more drawings. Your second drawing most commonly is the sectional view for the design. Then you'll add elevations as needed for elevation information for each of the scenic units. You will also perhaps add details for construction of special pieces. Every time you add a design, you change the page number, and you'll eventually have all the full page sets needed to represent the full design. So our show is now complete. We are working on the ground plan, page 1. We begin by placing the platforming and the step units. So here is a zoomed in view of our theater ground plan, and we've established the basic layout of where the platforming is going to be. Using the center line and using the plaster line, it helps determine how much it's going to stick past the plaster line out onto the apron of the stage and how it's positioned left to right from center of the stage. We can, at this point, do what's called a layout plan to help establish how standard platforms can be used to help create this shape, and then the unusual wedge shapes that have to be built to help in between all these platform pieces. It helps as you're designing to stay within standard shapes as much as possible. You will save money by using standard platforms. If they have to construct all of your platforming in unusual shapes, especially in curves, you will use a major part of your budget. But if they can use standard 4x8s or 4x4s or wedge pieces that they will have in stock, you will save a lot of money and only have to pay for the other pieces that represent the rest of the platforming. Next, you should add step units. So we have the step unit upstage, which we talked about before. We also have the front door step at the top left as we look at it. And over on the right, we have a step up to the patio area just outside the French doors. Now we'll add wall units. We'll represent those on top of the platforms. Perhaps in the top right again you see there are some cupboards and counters in the kitchen area, and downstage of those is a bookshelf out in the main room. We'll represent all of those as built-in vertical structures as part of the set. If we zoom in, we'll notice how we represent doors. The concept is that a floor plan is everything that touches the floor of the stage. Above a door, when a door is cut out, becomes a dotted line because it's not touching the floor. These doors swing different directions, and we will typically add the swing by using a curved dotted line to represent movement of that door. Some doors might be swinging doors, such as this one to the kitchen, so it swings both directions, and we'll represent that with arrows. Now we have all of the walls inserted, the doors all represented open, and the swing represented by the dotted lines. Much of what we're doing here is represented in the USITT Scenic Design and Technical Production Graphics Standards. USITT stands for the United States Institute for Theater Technology, a professional organization to which many scenic designers belong. In 1992, USITT established a vocabulary of images that can be used to represent the different type of construction for walls, windows, and all type of building construction for scenic design. Some of the pages within the book represent walls, thicknesses, and one just needs to go through this technical book of guidelines to understand a common vocabulary that can be used so that anyone can understand a ground plan if they're using these standard information symbols. Here's representation of some dimensioning and how walls might go together, junctions. Here's doors, windows, and platforming. Next, we'll insert furniture pieces. These are represented with small boxes and shapes that signify different types of furniture pieces. Now we need to include notes as needed. If we want to allow the shop to know that we are using a particular material for covering one area, or if there's a particularly unusual construction technique being used somewhere, we'll want to represent that in a technical note, typically typed in, and then a line showing where that actual construction or note is on the design. We can also label as much as we need to help anyone looking at the design understand what furniture pieces are or any other unusual object that may not be obvious in the rendering. Then we'll add dimension as we discussed. Initial ground plan for this design is complete. There are times you might want to help the shop understand how to actually lay out your design on stage. This is called a layout ground plan, in which a simple outline of the set is represented and dimensions are added so we can see how your set fits within the relationship of the plaster line and center line of the stage. This information is not typically given on a regular or technical ground plan because this much information might only confuse someone trying to look at the full plan with all of its detail. So, what types of ground plans are there? First, let's talk about the director's ground plan. A director's ground plan can be simplified just so the director and the stage manager can understand the simple placement of your set on stage, where platforms are, where furniture lies, and this information will be used by the stage manager to actually tape out your scenic design in the acting studio. The technical ground plan is the one that we've been discussing the most. It represents most of the information the shop needs to place your set, to know some of the standard heights of the walkable units, to understand where masking and backing units will all be in relation to the scenic design, and any other pertinent information that would help install your set into the theater space. And then we already mentioned a layout ground plan. in which you might represent the actual platforms and the actual shape of the set in relation to specific areas of the stage, the plaster line, the center line of the stage, the proscenium lines, and this stage even has a turntable in the middle. And while it's not being used, it is still drawn into the layout plan just to help the shop understand, as they set it up, the relationship of the set to the actual physical mechanics of the theater space. Hopefully this has been a good introduction to ground plans that will allow you to begin to create your first ground plan for this class.